Welcome back to another episode of the Radio Psychs, your premier podcast for insights into everything mental health. I'm Dr. Aaron Haddock.
And I'm Dr. Rhonda Yu. We're psychologists who care about people and bringing science to practice.
And we're so glad to have you join us.
Please note that the information shared in this episode is solely intended for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not a substitute for professional medical or mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment.
Today's episode is on the causes of the youth mental health crisis.
In December 2021, the U.S. Surgeon General issued an advisory on the urgent need to address the growing mental health crisis among young people, confirming widespread increases in anxiety, depression, and other mental health concerns.
Then, in May 2023, the American Psychological Association released a health advisory on social media use in adolescents, followed by a June 2024 advisory from the Surgeon General. Both emphasized growing evidence that excessive social media use is linked to negative mental health outcomes in youth.
While the uptick in mental health problems among youth is widely accepted, the factors driving this are still very much a matter of debate.
And as professionals and people who deeply care about youth mental health, understanding the true causes and developing effective solutions has been an important part of our work.
Yeah, that's right.
So, in this episode, we're going to dive into the complex web of factors contributing to the youth mental health crisis.
While social media and technology are increasingly at the forefront of this discussion, they're just one piece of the puzzle.
This debate's been going on for years, but these advisories, coupled with the success of Jonathan Haidt's new book, The Anxious Generation, How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness, has really heated it up, hasn't it?
It has. Why don't we begin with Haidt's thesis in the book?
Sounds good. In The Anxious Generation, Haidt argues that the mental health crisis among youth didn't just happen out of the blue. Instead, he tells the story dramatically as a tragedy in 3 acts.
Haidt argues that after World War II, social capital and the sense of trust and connection in America was at an all-time high. But over the decades, due to various reasons like smaller family sizes and people retreating indoors with TV and air conditioning, the sense of community began to erode.
And this erosion of social capital led to a decline in trust and community engagement. This is what Haidt calls Act 1 of the tragedy.
Act 2, according to Haidt, is the loss of a play-based childhood. He explains that children used to spend a lot of time playing outside, which is crucial for their development. Free play helps kids develop social skills, manage risks, and build resilience.
But starting in the late 80s and 90s, parents became increasingly fearful for their children's safety. Concerns about kidnapping, sexual abuse, and other dangers led to children being kept indoors more often. This overprotection meant that kids increasingly missed out on the benefits of unstructured playtime.
Around the same time, we had the advent of personal computers and the arrival of the internet, which proved to be very attractive alternatives to goofing around outside with friends.
And then we moved to Act 3, the massive, sudden transformation of childhood with the advent of smartphones and social media between 2010 and 2015. Haidt calls this the great rewiring of childhood and the rise of the phone-based childhood.
By 2010, most teens had cell phones, but these were basic phones without internet access. By 2015, the majority of teens had smartphones with front-facing cameras and social media apps. This shift allowed for constant online interaction and the rise of selfie culture.
Haidt further argues that this technological change, especially the popularity of platforms like Instagram, significantly impacted mental health. It was around 2012 that we saw a sharp increase in anxiety, depression, and self-harm among teenagers, particularly girls.
He suggests that the pressures of social media, the constant comparison, and the addictive nature of these platforms, which we discussed in our episode on social media, are major contributors to the mental health crisis.
But he also notes that it's not just about social media. It's about the broader transformation of childhood and all of the things kids are not doing when they're on screens, namely sleeping, having face-to-face interactions, exercising, and focusing and engaging deeply with things like reading and schoolwork.
And this brings us to the debate. While Haidt's thesis is compelling and appears to be gaining significant traction, especially among parents and educators, the research literature indicates there are other factors we need to consider.
Exactly. And while Haidt's thesis has certainly sparked a lot of discussion, it's important to look at some of the critiques of his argument.
There's a substantial body of research, including several meta-analyses and systematic reviews, that challenges the idea that social media is the primary culprit behind the youth mental health crisis.
Right. This research literature was summarized in an important report by the U.S. National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, which concluded that available research that links social media to health shows small effects and weak associations. Contrary to the current cultural narrative that social media is universally harmful to adolescents, the reality is more complicated.
In fact, some studies suggest that young people who already have mental health problems may use social media more frequently or in more deleterious ways, rather than social media causing those problems.
This nuance is crucial because it shifts the perspective from social media as a cause to social media as a possible symptom or coping mechanism.
And it's not just about social media. Critics argue that the mental health crisis among youth is driven by a complex set of other well-documented factors,
Such as
early exposure to stressors and adversity like economic hardship, violence and discrimination, a family history of mental disorders, school and family-related stressors, the long-term impacts of the pandemic, academic pressures, and the overall stress of just living in an increasingly uncertain world.
Yeah, and that's not to mention the opioid crisis, school shootings, political tensions, and, as the Surgeon General underscored in an advisory released just last month, dangerous levels of parental stress.
Candace Odgers, an expert on the impact of tech on youth, summarized it this way in her review of Haidt's book in the journal Nature. The evidence is equivocal on whether screen time is to blame for rising levels of teen depression and anxiety, and rising hysteria could distract us from tackling the real causes.
And she went on to say in an interview that if you asked experts to list the top 10 factors driving anxiety and depression in teens, social media would not be on the list.
It's also worth noting that while more young people are now talking openly about their mental health struggles, there are insufficient services to meet their needs.
In the US, for example, teens and their families often wait months to see a mental health professional or end up in the emergency room, which only tends to make things worse.
And there's an average of one school psychologist for about every 1,100 students, which is far from adequate.
So, while it's important to consider the role played by tech and social media, we've got to consider the harms as well as the benefits. Mental health issues among youth are multifaceted and caused by both individual and societal factors.
Absolutely. Now, I'd say Haidt does offer some valuable suggestions like stricter content moderation, designing platforms with user age in mind, and even restricting smartphone access in schools. But we have to be careful not to oversimplify things. The problem is complex, and our solutions need to match that complexity.
Exactly. It's not just about limiting screen time. We need to focus more on expanding access to mental health services, addressing social determinants of health, and fostering environments that support our youth's overall well-being.
I couldn't agree more.
We're out of time, but in future episodes, we'll dive deeper into the actionable steps that parents, educators, and policymakers can take to support the mental health of our youth.
Sounds like a plan. As always, thanks for tuning in to the Radio Psychs. If you have any questions or topics you'd like for us to cover, feel free to reach out to us. Until next time, take care and be well, everybody.
Take care and be well.